My name is Ailsa Barry, and I am the Vice President for Experience and Engagement here at the Canadian Museum of Nature. Bienvenue à la première causerie de notre série stimulante et instructive sur la santé du cerveau et le bien-être. Welcome to the first in our summer speaker series connected with brain health and wellness. Talk Brain. This series was coordinated by the museum in collaboration with the Ontario Brain Institute, which has provided valuable expertise as the knowledge sponsor for our special summer exhibition, Brain, the Inside Story. And I hope you have a chance to see that sometime this evening. It's also been a sponsor for our affiliated programming, such as tonight's event. And we are also really grateful to the TV Ontario for providing the live stream of tonight's presentation. Now, today is National Indigenous Peoples Day, and we must rightfully acknowledge that the museum is built on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. As a National Natural History Museum, we are continually looking at new ways to engage and inspire people about the natural world. And incorporating the stories of humans into this realm is increasingly important today. One example is our new Canada Goose Arctic Gallery that opened exactly 1 year ago. And a driving directive of this project was to ensure that we incorporated the stories and voices of the Indigenous people that have lived in the Arctic and who continue to connect with the Arctic's land and resources in ways that we can all learn from. Tonight, we are very pleased to delve further into the importance of Indigenous culture and connection to the land with tonight's presentation by Carol Hopkins. To tell you more about Ms. Hopkins and the event, please welcome Dr. Kirk Nyland, Director of Outreach for the Ontario Brain Institute. Je vous présente maintenant Monsieur Kirk Nyland de l'Institut Ontarien du Cerveau. Kirk.
Thank you, Ailsa. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'd like to start by recognizing our elders that have joined us this evening. Thank you. Hello, bonjour, Annie, bonjour. Je m'appelle Kirk Nyland et je suis le directeur de diffusion de savoir de l'Institut Ontarien du Cerveau. The Ontario Brain Institute is a provincially funded organization that works to improve the lives of people living with brain disorder. Nous travaillons avec les chercheurs, les cliniciens, l'industrie et les patients pour nous assurer que l'excellence neuroscientifique ontarienne se traduise en impact concret grâce à la recherche, la commercialisation et les soins. Une partie de notre rôle consiste à rejoindre le public et à permettre à des gens comme vous d'apprendre sur le cerveau, les troubles cérébraux et le travail transformé en cours de la province. We are pleased to partner with the Canadian Museum of Nature to present the Talk Brain series, Conversations about Brain Health in Ottawa. Tonight's theme is really about connectivity. Connectivity is essential to who we are, how our brain works. Our brain is comprised of 100 billion cells, each which makes thousands of connections. So we're fundamentally dependent on connectivity. Protein to protein, cell to cell, neuron to neuron, person to person, and tonight, as we'll learn, we are connected as people to the land. Connectivity is fundamental to who we are. I will introduce tonight's speakers, moderator, and elder. Then I will ask Elder Dorothy Maness to come up and provide an opening prayer. After our speakers are finished, there will be an opportunity to ask questions via tweeting OBI, and I think there's going to be instructions on the screen behind me. After the question period, Elder Maness will come up and provide a closing prayer. A video of the talk will be made available, and we encourage you to share it with others, and stay tuned for future public talks by subscribing on our website at braininstitute.ca. Nous sommes fiers d'associer à TV Ontario pour notre série de conversations publiques, et la conversation de ce soir est diffusée en direct sur tvo.org. Our speaker tonight is Carol Hopkins. Carol is the executive director of the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation, a nonprofit organization whose mandate is drawn from the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework and the Honoring Our Strengths, a renewed framework to address substance use issues among First Nations people in Canada. Carol was recently named to the Order of Canada for her work in mental health and addictions as an advocate for culturally based treatment. She has spent more than 20 years in the field of First Nations addictions and mental health. She holds a Master's of Social Work degree from the University of Toronto and a degree in Sacred Indigenous Knowledge, equivalent to a PhD in Western-based education systems. Carol, miigwech and welcome. Our moderator tonight is André Picard. André, as many of you know, is an award-winning health journalist who has been with the Globe and Mail for over 20 years. He is widely considered the top journalist in the country. André has received numerous awards and has also been named Canada's first public health hero by the Canadian Public Health Association and a champion of mental health by the Canadian Alliance on Mental Illness and Mental Health. André, thank you and welcome.
I come from the Delaware Nation, known as the Lenape people. And we're located in southwestern Ontario along the Thames River, just southwest of London. My father is from the Munsee Delaware First Nation, and my mother is from the Delaware Nation at Moraviantown, which is named after the Moravian missionaries that settled there with us. Our people originated on the East Coast and then migrated inland. I'm also the executive director of the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation, and I want to recognize our elder, Dorothy Miness, for the prayer that she offered, and want to recognize our hosts here at the Museum of Nature. Thank you very much. And for the invitation by the Ontario Brain Institute for asking me to come and share with you this evening an Indigenous perspective around culture, our connection to land, and how that impacts on our wellness. I want to start with a story that I'm not going to tell you the fullness of it for sure, because this story takes a long time. But the foundation of our knowledge and our evidence and our way of knowing about how to live life in a good way comes from our story of creation. And what we know from that story of creation is that the Creator imagined the most beautiful place where life would grow. And that story takes place at a time before there was anything physical in this world, and so it was only spirit. And that place is described as never-ending darkness. And it's not like a darkness that we understand in this physical world, where our children are afraid of the dark, and my grandson now is at that stage where there's monsters under the bed and in the closet. Not that kind of darkness. It's a darkness that they say is pure, and it's full of love, because it's only the Great Spirit that exists there. And so in that time, what was happening was thinking about how life would emerge, and where would life emerge, and what would life look like. And so we're told that across all Indigenous cultures, we have a story of creation. And our stories of creation are the foundation for our worldview. And they are always spirit-based. They start with spirit. And then they move on to the creation of this physical world and all that we know that exists in the universe. And so why is this important? It's because that as those thoughts traveled out, they said that they touched on the darkness and they left an imprint. And that imprint can still be seen today, and it's the star world. And so it's a forever reminder to us that the original thoughts of the Creator are visible to us and therefore accessible to us forever and all time. And that what was thought about in the very beginning is, and still exists, is relevant for every generation of people that live on this earth. And so the answer is always accessible. So I ask you to think about that, when you think about the world and creation and what life looks like, how do you imagine that to be for people, for all colors of people? Because we're told that every color of people has their own story about creation, and that all those stories are true. Not competitive with each other, not for us as Anishinaabe people or original people of this land to discount or debate. It said that all creation stories are true. And we know that from this story is the pattern that was established for the unfolding of all life. And so we think about how the story talks about the Creator's thoughts touching upon the darkness. Then it's also, we can see that repeated again throughout all patterns of creation. So as mums are working hard to bring forth new life when they're carrying their babies, the very first sense of our five senses is a sense of touch that is developed. And so it's just an example about how our stories of creation inform our knowledge and understanding about how life emerges and how life grows. And then we know, again from this story, that for every stage of life, throughout the full span of life, that the Creator ensured life for us. The Creator ensured that there would be a way to nurture good life, and that we would be able to find a way to live life in its fullest. And that the pattern of creation, again, another example, as Kirk was talking about neurons, that our neuron cells are patterned in the same way after the star galaxies. They look the same. And so again, it's the patterns of creation that continue to unfold continuously across life. Now, I'm using English words here, but the evidence of our knowledge based on neurons and star galaxies is in our language. And so when we, as an organization, are looking for elders to speak to about Indigenous knowledge and about sacred knowledge, then we go and find elders who have very specific language that talks about the unfolding of creation and how we understand ourselves as human beings, and then how do we nurture life in its fullest. So it's a strength-based approach. So here's another example. Did you know that the sound of the heartbeat is patterned in the sound of the drum? And so it's said that the sound of the drum works in such a way that all regions of our brain act in unison. Now, you might naturally think that our brain acts in unison all of the time. But if you have a life that has been impacted by trauma in some way, or for Indigenous people of our life that's been impacted by intergenerational trauma, colonization, racism, and oppression, then it affects the way that our brain works in response to the environment around us. And so as helpers in the field of mental wellness, we're always trying to think, what do we know from our own culture that helps us to influence the way that the brain works, and so that we can respond to life around us in a way that is more representative of the gifts that the Creator gave to us to live life. And so the drum sounds and stimulates all regions of our brain to work together in unison, rather from the patterns that are created from the intergenerational trauma that may not have been addressed. And another way of thinking about that is that sometimes when people hear the drum for the first time, they feel this emotion like they want to cry, and they're not quite sure why that is. And if you've ever had that experience, if you've heard the sound of a drum perhaps, you might think about why would that occur? And from our knowledge as Indigenous people, we would say that that's because the sound of the drum is the same sound and rhythm as all of creation and the universe. And so it's a spirit-based sound. And it's the spirit connecting with your spirit to awaken something within you so that you feel the pattern of and the rhythm of all of creation. Again, critically important to our wellness. And even in the circle, how many of you guys have ever been to a powwow? So, quite a few of you. Good. So you'll notice that in the powwow that there's different kinds of dances. There's different kinds of regalia. And sometimes they all come together. That pattern and that structure to the powwow circle is the same pattern that was created in our story of creation. So when the heartbeat of the universe first sounded, it put everything into its order in the universe. So all of the stars and all of the star galaxy. And so again, the powwow circle is about creating and recreating the order of life and the rhythm of life and feeling the spirit of life. When our children are born, it's again modeled after the story of creation that is about securing our wellness. And so when our children are born, it's really important that they touch the earth for the very first time. And again, it's patterned after how human being was placed in creation. And it's said that everything in the universe and everything in creation, meaning on the earth, all the plants, the animals, what's above the earth and below the earth and in the universe around us, was all complete without human beings, that we were the last ones to be placed in creation. And that when we, and this is from Anishinabe's story, that when we were placed in creation, they say that we pointed our feet so that we wouldn't harm not even one blade of grass. That the way that we came into creation was with the desire for harmony and for peace, the connection and the interconnection of all of life. And so we understand everything in creation as our older relatives. And if you've ever heard anybody talk about the rock as our grandfather or as our grandmother, it's because they're the oldest ones in creation. The rock was here first. And they've seen everything in creation from that time. Everything came after the rock was here first, and people being the last ones in creation. And so the reason we talk about everything in creation as our relatives is because we were all created by the Creator. The Creator gave us all life. Human beings, we have the ability to think, act, feel, and we have a spirit. Everything in creation has a spirit because it was created by the Creator. And it therefore has ability to think, act, and feel. Think about that. That's not something that we learn about in education, that creation has a spirit. And that has had a significant impact on our relationship with the land and with creation. Because in a Western worldview, we, without thinking of the land and the earth and the beings in creation as having spirit, we assume that we have rights. Rights of dominance, rights of control, and rights of ownership. And those rights interfere with the spirit of creation. And so from an Indigenous worldview, and it's in our language, the way that we talk about all of creation, there's no assumption that we can own the earth or that we have a right to dominate or control the earth. In fact, our story says we have an obligation for relationship with land and all beings of creation, and that our wellness is dependent upon that relationship with creation. And so this is a picture of my grandson. And he had a little bit of a hard time coming into the world. He actually wanted to come in really fast. And so he was supposed to be born in early August, and he made his entrance in he was supposed to be born in October. He came in August. And so when he arrived, there was lots of ceremonial things that we did to support him in his journey into this world. But when he arrived, what you don't see in this picture is all of his family and his cousins that gathered around to witness his presence in creation, which secured him in this world. And so this was August when he didn't come home until October, when he would have been born. And so it was still pretty warm outside, and so we lowered him to the earth. His mother is there holding him. But his little feet went like this as soon as the grass touched the bottom of his feet. And so his cousins gently helped him to touch the earth. And again, it's about securing his spirit in this physical world, securing his life to ensure that he would continue to have life. Such a simple act, but very meaningful, when we think about the spirit first. And we know that our connection to creation, so the land and all beings of creation, are critically important for our wellness. And that when we facilitate healing and wellness, that connection to land is as important as all of the methods and the theories that we use in psychotherapy and in counseling, and as well as our nutrition and our physical exercise and what it is that we think about our life and the life experiences that we may have had. So connection to land is critically important for our wellness. We also know that from our story of creation that there was a beautiful ceremony that happened that involved the naming of everything in creation. And so we have these characters in our sacred stories and in our knowledge and in our sacred societies that talk about how everything was named. So all of the different types of rock, all of the different kinds of water, all of the different beings in creation, from the smallest of insects to all of the animals, to all of the birds, all of the different kinds of skies and clouds. All of them were named in the language. And as they were named in the language, the name isn't something simply like Carol. You know, Carol doesn't really mean anything to me. It was a name that my parents liked, and so they gave it to me. But my name, Nojem, is based on spirit, and it indicates something about my personality, about my traits, about my characteristics, and also gives me some indication about my purpose in life. So when you think about your own life, how many times have you asked yourself the question of what is my purpose? What am I meant to do in this world? What should I be doing? What kind of career path do I want to take? And for us, in the name is the description of that, and that description comes from the spirit, so that when we know our name, we have an understanding of what the Creator intended for us to do while we are in this world. And those names for different cultures come from different places. Some cultures, it's important that the name come from somebody in the family who has been deceased for a period of time and has gone on. So it's the continuity of the ancestry that's critically important. For Algonquin nations of people or Anishinaabe people or Lenape people, the names typically come from beings in creation. So they represent something of the sky realm or the earth realm or our relatives in creation. And we take on those traits and characteristics as a gift from them about how it is that we are to live life. And so this quote comes from Elder Jim Dumont, and he says, all of life loves you and wants you to be and become. And so that's why they lend their identity to us, to help us to know how to live in creation. Because as we as human beings, being the last one in creation, we were given one additional gift, and that's the gift of free will. And so we can make decisions and choices about how we want to live life. But the tree is always the tree, and the eagle is always the eagle. They never try to be something that they are not. They only live out the truth of life. And they know how to live in relation to other beings in creation. And so they lend their identity to us to help us understand. And we understand that the pattern and the stringing together of the sacred seeds of life, which we know is our DNA, and again, we know this from our sacred languages that have these words that describe them. So in our language is not noun-based, it's verb-based. And because it's verb-based, it describes the action and the purpose and the orientation of that being. And so the way that the DNA is described is as spirit seeds. And so we understand that the DNA is strung together not just physically, but spiritually as well. And that the pattern of the stringing together of those sacred seeds is visible in the way that we take care of our children. And so the lacing up of those two pictures, those babies are in Ticonogans or cradle boards. And the lacing up of those cradle boards is a forever reminder that our responsibility as family is to dress up the DNA, to take care of the expression of the DNA. And so today, there's science that talks about this in the context of epigenetics. The impact of the environment on the expression of the gifts that we carry in our DNA or our genetic makeup. And so, without talking about epigenetics, our ancestors had knowledge, still have knowledge, about how we take care of those seeds of life and the responsibilities that we have. And these Ticonogans were not meant to lay down, they sat up. And the reason they sat up was so that from the time of birth, our children could always observe life around them, and so that they could know that they had a place of belonging, and that they were learning at the same time, and they were dressed up with their identity. So this one in the middle, that's my grandson, the one that had a hard time coming into the world, and this other baby is a picture I got off the internet. But this guy here, he's Crane Clan, and so there's a picture of a crane on his Tikhonogan. And so the crane has a way of living in creation, and if you want to understand what does it mean to be Crane Clan, then you would study how does the crane live, and that would be your role. And for us as Anishinaabe people, the crane is a chief clan, and it's a clan that is a chief about relationships with other people, other nations of people. And so my grandson is in that line. And so again, the pattern of creation continues to repeat itself in all aspects of our life as human beings. If we want to understand how to facilitate wellness, then it's to creation that we look to understand how to do that, because the patterns are always there for us. Our knowledge systems are still intact across this land and across the cultures of Indigenous people. We have our sacred lodges, which are our universities, which are our hospitals, which are our social structures. They are our education systems. And every culture of people has a certain way that they build their lodges, which is the structure for understanding their worldview. We did this research project to understand and to define what is Indigenous wellness in this time. And so we asked these questions. What is a whole and healthy person? So think about that. What would be your immediate answer if I asked you that? What's a whole and healthy person? And when you think about that, would you think about just the physical being, our physical wellness? This talk is about mental wellness, so I'm sure you would think about mental health as well. But would you think about spiritual wellness? And when you think about mental wellness, is it also about the way the mind works, or is it just about our emotional health? So, and then how does culture facilitate wellness is another question we asked. And if we use culture to facilitate wellness, then what should we expect the outcomes to be? And so across the country, we didn't create a pan-Indian, which is a synthesis of a whole bunch of different approaches and create something brand new. We created something that is what we like to refer to as collective wisdom to define wellness. And so wellness outcomes are measured by hope, belonging, meaning, and purpose. Every human being wants to have hope in their life. You want to know where you belong in this world. You want to know what is the meaning of your life and what's your purpose in creation. And so we created these outcomes that are facilitated through 13 different indicators. So identity, worldview, your belief system creates hope. Having a relationship with land, family, and community creates belonging. Here's something different, attitude. Attitude isn't the way we understand attitude typically. Attitude is an attitude towards living life. Having an attitude towards living life is possible when you have connection to land and creation. Because land and creation will always listen to you, will always see you as family, will always help take care of you as family. And so there's lots of ceremonial practices that we have that include spending time on the land. Attitude towards living life requires connection to family and community. It requires an understanding of your identity and where you come from, what's your worldview. And in meaning, it's facilitated not only by the rational knowledge, but intuitive knowledge, which is spirit-based knowledge. And so when our children are at the adolescent stage of life, it's important that they go out on the land for a period of time. And that those answers that are facilitated there they come from the land. And then our purpose is facilitated by understanding that as Indigenous people, we have a unique way of being in this world and a unique way of doing things. We also have, across cultures, an understanding about the developmental stages of life. But our developmental stages of life are not just psychological developmental stages of life, as Erik Erikson defined them to be. They are spiritually grounded stages of life. And so if we want wellness, then even before our babies come into this world, there are spiritual activities that are critically important for ensuring a good journey into this world, like my grandson who had a difficult time. There were lots of activities that we did to ensure a safe journey. And then when he arrived, it was touching his feet on the earth. Very simple act, but there were other things. And then for every stage of life, there is a spiritual activity that is critically important to facilitate wellness. So early childhood, at adolescent stage of life, which we call the fast life because everything is moving quickly. Young people are trying to determine, what their identity is and their social circle and network and who they are. And at that wandering and wondering stage of life, what's my purpose? What's the meaning of my life? How am I going to live that? What am I going to set aside from what my family gave me? Because, we all go through that stage of, I'm not going to be like my mother. I'm not going to do what my father did. And then we end up doing that anyways, and we're trying to sort things out about how we're going to live life and what we're going to do in life. And on goes, every stage builds upon the other, and every stage of life requires some activity that reestablishes and reconnects our spirit to creation. So I want to tell you about one way that we have, in this time, in this generation of people on the earth, understood our connection to land is critically important, our relationship to water. Water is a commodity for sale, and an elder said that if we don't take care of the water, he said one day we're going to sit in our meetings and our water we'll be drinking water out of plastic bottles. And at that time, people couldn't imagine it. They thought he was crazy. And he said that if we don't take care of the water, then that water will cost us more than an ounce of gold. And he said that we have to do something about that. So in 2003, there was this grandmother who decided that she was going to walk around all of the Great Lakes praying for the water. And she did that. Every single Great Lake and along the St. Lawrence, she carried a pail of water and prayed for the water. She prayed for all of the rivers, all of the streams, all of the glaciers, in the mountains, all of the lakes, and we walked through the snow. I was on several of these walks. We started walking before the sun rose, after the sun set, and despite record-breaking floods that happened in 2011, the women kept walking in this Four Directions water walk in 2011. So they walked from the Gulf of Mexico straight up through all of those tornadoes where all of those blue dots are, and across the prairie. So I walked across the state of Montana praying for the water. We were blessed with painted faces by the people, the Blackfeet people of Montana, took care of us that way. And why would you do that? Why would you walk day after day carrying a pail of water, praying for all of that water at every stream, every river, of the glaciers, all of that? Why would anybody want to do that? Spend all of that time in prayer for the water. And it reflects our worldview, which is our belief. So in Western society, typically the worldview is, I'll believe it when I see it. Requires evidence and proof first. For Indigenous people, it's I believe it, therefore it is. I believe the spirit of water is critical for all of life. All of life depends upon water, and water has a spirit. And we, as relatives in creation, have an obligation and responsibility to take care of that water. And so I'll finish off with this poem that was written. He thought to make earth upon which to scatter his seeds. And earth shall be my companion. And in so doing, earth was made woman. And to this day, the mother of all things. Raindrops were his tears of joy upon seeing her. Water is her life-giving blood, the lakes, the streams, rivers, and her veins. Both above the ground and below, that this is true, we all know. And so the earth is critical to the wellness of our mother, the earth. And if our mother, the earth, is not well, then we as people will not be well. And so her lifeblood is, just think about all of the diseases we have as human beings. If our blood is not well, if we had cancer in our blood, what would we do? How would we attend to that? And so it was the same kind of thinking that if we want to ensure healthy water for our future generations, then we have an obligation to do something about that. And the belief is that prayer is powerful. Showing our Mother the Earth that we love her and her water was critically important, and so that's why those water walks happened. To nurture the seeds of the future. For example, the berries. They're the very first foods that come up from the earth. And if the berries ever stop growing, our elders say that no other food will grow. And so if we take care of the water, then we take care of the seeds of life. We take care of the foods. And seeds of life continue to grow. So prayer is critically important for our future and our connection to land. Prayer is a way of connecting and communicating with the land. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Carol, for that very thoughtful presentation. Just to remind you, my name's André Picard, and I have the privilege to ask Dr. Hopkins a few questions on your behalf. And to remind you, if you want to ask questions, please tweet to Ontario Brain. We're doing this because there's privacy issues with this being live streamed, so we can't have a mic in the room. It's not to offend you, but it's just a practical thing. So please feel free to tweet, and they're going to pass me up the questions. We got a couple that came in during the talk, so we'll incorporate those. And what I want to do is sort of build, not to talk directly about the talk, but to build off that a bit to some current events and some current political issues and get your thoughts on that. So we know that the history, the tools of colonialism are to strip people of their land and their language and their culture. That's what we've done to Indigenous peoples for hundreds of years in Canada. But I'd like you to talk about the flip side of that equation. How can culture and connection to the land and language, how can that help with healing and reconciliation?
That's a big question. Yes. I've got lots to say about it. So first of all, you saw in one of my slides where I said that our sacred lodges are still firmly planted. There's lots of people that think that our language and our culture have gone away and they're no longer accessible, that we don't have that anymore. And that's also perpetuated by news and media that talks about the crisis in our communities and all of the issues that we face. The assumption that if we had access to these things that we say are the answers, then why do we have these situations still in our community? And the answer is that we have ancestors who ensured our culture and our language would continue, and so it is still accessible. But colonization has removed that from being central and foundational in our life every day. In fact, the programs and services and the funding that we get for programs and services in our community have not been based on Indigenous knowledge. There aren't any post-secondary institutions that encourage the use of Indigenous knowledge. The schools in our communities, they have to live by the curriculum standards of the province or the territory. And so access to Indigenous knowledge is making its way from the periphery where it currently exists to be central in our families and in our communities and in our programs and services and in our education systems. And so we have lots of people thinking a lot about the news today, constantly about the people from Mexico who had their children removed from them as they were trying to cross the border. And those children were sent all over the United States. And so for thousands of children, they don't even know if they can reunite them with their parents. And as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking the same thing that happened with the scoop of the 60s. The scoop of the 60s is a child welfare system that took our children away from us. At the same time, residential schools were still happening. Child welfare joined and started taking our children away and sending them all over the world, not just all over this land, but all over the world, lost to their family and their community. So I'm thinking about those people, our relatives, who are still trying to find their way back. And then we heard about a court decision around compensation for scoop of the 60s people. Those people are looking for their identity. They need to know who they are. You look at any child welfare stats and you'll see the breakdown in adoption and foster care and group home care because of the lack of connection and relationship based on identity. So colonization and assimilation has done a really good job at teaching Indigenous people that our culture isn't relevant, our language isn't relevant, it's not meaningful. And so we're still reversing that. And people who have been through residential schools, another decision with Scoop of the 60s was that there would be a healing foundation established. So through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, lots of people with lots of courage told heart-wrenching stories about their experience in the Scoop of the 60s. The residential school system. And that traumatic experience has transcended one generation to the next. The violence that we see, the hardship that we see in our community is a direct result of colonization. So these people that have experienced this trauma, have lived through these experiences, have not had their culture accessible to them because it went underground and it lived on the periphery. Our families were punished for speaking languages, their own language. They were punished for practicing their culture. It was outlawed. It was against the law in Canada to speak an Indigenous language and to practice our culture. And so that's why it went underground, and it just slowly coming back. And so when people went through a hard time in life, what do you do when you're going through a hard time in life? You talk to family. You might go see a counselor. You might rely on traditions in your family to help you through that. None of those things were available to Indigenous people. And so today, people who have reconnected with culture have found their healing journey. So here's an example. I was a director of a youth treatment center for about 13 years. And for youth in residential treatment, on average, about 50% of them, youth going into residential treatment, will finish residential treatment. In the program that I ran, 100% of the youth finished that program. They stayed because of the cultural program. And they said, why did I have to end up in such trauma in my life before I had access to something so meaningful? As a result of the program, and this is the other thing that's commonly believed, you send a young person to treatment, then they have to go back to the same family and community that has not changed. So, what hope do those young people have? Well, let me tell you, that's a statement of disbelief in young people. These young people that chose to stay in this residential treatment program went back to school. They re-engaged in positive social activities in their community. They continued cultural practices. In fact, they continued prayer. There was one young girl who went home to her community, and she kept resisting the peer pressure from her siblings primarily, but also her friends, to go out and sniff gas. That's what she was in treatment for. She was sniffing gas on a regular basis. And her mother noticed this and said, you know, how is it that you're not going out sniffing gas anymore? And she said, I learned how to pray. And I learned that as a woman, my connection to water is really important, and it's a source of strength. So every time I feel like, you know, all of that pressure is getting to be too much, I take my medicine and I go and I sit by the lake and I pray. And then she also went to the community radio station, because another unfortunate behavior is youth like to hear their names on the radio station, and so sometimes they engage in negative coping skills just to hear their name on the radio station. Sometimes that's attempted suicide with no intention of completion. And then all of this attention comes to them when that happens. For her, she turned that around, and she went to the community radio station to sing gospel songs. She didn't see any conflict between singing gospel songs and praying with traditional medicines by the water. And her mother was able to observe that that actually worked for her. And so the mother told her sisters, and her sisters are now going with their niece to the water to pray for good life.
And your comments reminded me of a study I was reading about. We know there's an epidemic of suicide in Indigenous communities, but it's very disparate. There are some communities with no suicide and some with very high rates. And what this study found is where people speak their language, where they're culturally connected, there is no suicide.
That's right.
So I want to talk about the culture aspect. If people are going to recapture their culture, that doesn't happen magically. You need programs, you need support. Are we investing in the right programs, the right kind of supports?
Slowly we are, yeah. You know, we have a new commitment towards Indigenous languages in this country. Still not one of the official languages, but still a commitment to investing in Indigenous language. And it isn't just the ability to say words or to speak in language. It's the investment in understanding the worldview that is held within the language that's critically important. In terms of cultural programs and services, again, you know, First Nations communities, Inuit communities are underfunded, don't have available services in their communities. And so mental health has been a responsibility of the provinces and territorial governments, not a responsibility of the federal government. And so access to mental health services has been few and far between for a long, long time. We had the Aboriginal Healing Foundation in place that was investing in culture-based healing. We have a network of residential treatment services who use culture as a foundation, including the treatment center I talked about. We also have these new frameworks, the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework, that promotes the use of culture. And we've been fortunate enough to have some governments, provincial governments, interested in knowing more about the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework and how do you formalize Indigenous culture in policy and in programs and services. And so that's actually most of the work that we do at Thunderbird Partnership Foundation, is the translation of that sacred Indigenous knowledge to usable, accessible knowledge that is based on strengths of Indigenous people, based on our language, based on our culture. And so teaching and supporting service providers on how to formalize culture within policy and programs, because culture comes from the land, it comes from the community, it comes from people. But today we have programs and services that can be using culture and elders and cultural practitioners for service delivery. And so while we're trying to access more mental health services, psychotherapy, through social work, those kinds of things, we also need to be investing in our own knowledge. And in fact, the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework and the Honoring Our Strengths Framework are frameworks that were developed based on conversation with First Nations people across the country. And they said that we have to stop investing so much in adapting a Western worldview and making it fit our communities, to investing more in understanding what we already have in our worldview and in our languages and in our culture.
So as you said during your talk, a strength-based approach.
A strength-based approach. Critically important to understand that despite the crisis, despite the issues that we face in our communities, that First Nations people have many strengths, and those strengths come from our culture that has just survived despite colonization and oppression. In Nunavut, for example, the Inuit language, or Inuk language, isn't prominent in all of their programs and services, and yet it's a strong first language of the people. And so I heard the president of ITCase speaking lately, and she said, what would it be like for French-speaking people if we said, French, you're no longer required to speak French. Make it on your own. That's exactly what we're doing to the Inuit people in this country by not making the Inuk language a priority, at least in the territories where they live.
And especially when people are in healthcare, they're stressed, they want to speak their first language, they already have a bunch of issues to deal with, they don't need another one.
That's right.
Another barrier.
Yes, it is a barrier.
Now, we talk a lot about reconciliation, so I want most of us here are non-Indigenous tonight. Tell us, what can mainstream Canadians do to support First Nations culture? What should we do? Should we get out of the way, or what can we do?
We need friends and we need alliances. We need friends and we need alliances. And what that means is supporting First Nations voice, speaking for First Nations people. We need good friends that will not take over our voice or assume the right to speak on our behalf without us. We need friends and alliances who will work with us to help us to champion the solutions that we have in our communities. We have lots and lots of pilot-based evidence in our communities that demonstrate our strengths and our solutions, but they haven't had any long-term funding or support. And so friends and alliances can partner with us to help us negotiate those kinds of things. They can help us in ways of talking positively about Indigenous people. You know, I often hear the term Indigenous issues, and we need to change the way that we talk if we're going to change the way that we think. Conscientiously be aware of how we are talking about Indigenous people and describe them by their strengths. Bother to find out what those strengths are. Invest in learning about how those strengths can be exercised, I think is a strong demonstration of reconciliation.
And we only have time for one more question. I was getting the hook there. So to finish, I want to ask another question about reconciliation. I heard a talk from an elder recently who said, you know, reconciliation isn't just about Indigenous people. It will make society healthier and better. Can you reflect on that as well?
Yeah, reconciliation is everybody's responsibility. And knowing that Indigenous people belong in this country, that they have rights in this country, requires that you understand, why would people say that? You know, what does that mean? Why are we talking about the rights of Indigenous people and their place and their belonging in this country? And I was thinking about connection to land and remembering my own ancestors, my grandfathers, who fought in wars for this country when they were not yet citizens of this country. They didn't do that for the Canadian government. They did that for our family because they love this land. This is the land that they're from. That's why they did that. And so I think about that in terms of everybody has a responsibility to understand the history of Indigenous people in this country, and everybody has a responsibility to first ask themselves, why is the conversation uncomfortable for me, if it is uncomfortable? Why do I think about Indigenous people the way that I do? How is that different than my own values and my worldview? Why has society rejected Indigenous knowledge as evidence? Ask yourselves those questions. And then, you know, that creates a space then for that partnership and for that alliance. And so first, it's self-reflection. That's called cultural humility. Know yourself first. Know your values, your worldview, and your beliefs about Indigenous people. And then check out those assumptions. Create some awareness. Invest in learning and understanding. And I think that's a good place to start in terms of reconciliation.
Well, and thank you for helping us learn and understand a little bit more tonight with your very insightful comments, both at the podium and I had the pleasure to talk to you up here.
Thank you.
So I will do end Chig Miigwech.
Chig Miigwech.